the situation in Southport has been very, very difficult. And okay, that did turn into a proper what we would call a riot, and we saw police vans set on fire, and homes and other public buildings damaged, particularly the mosque that was a particular target. Now that clearly was very, very tricky, and for Merseyside police, that came upon them very quickly. They were dealing obviously with that large scale murder investigation, and that had obviously come upon them.
The Times reports that police are preparing for more violent disorder this weekend. Far-right activists are apparently planning to hold weekend rallies in at least 8 towns and cities across the UK. Posts shared on Telegram, the messaging app, and other social media channels are seemingly calling for patriots to take action, saying enough is enough. The Prime Minister's announced the formation of a new national violent disorder programme. The intention is to increase cooperation between police forces to crack down on far-right gatherings. Here's what Sir Keir Starmer had to say. Well, let's speak now to Donna Jones, Chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners. She's the Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Donna, good morning.
Morning.
It might be quite notable to people that Starmer's announcement seems to centre on the sharing of intelligence and certainly the increased use of facial recognition technology. Don't police forces share intelligence already?
Yes, we do, absolutely. And as you say, this violent disorder unit or violent disorder program, as I've also, the same as you heard it described, is very much focused, as you've said, on the sharing of intelligence, which does already happen across police forces. And we have 9 regional organised crime units across the country, which each ROCU, as their abbreviation is, will cover 3 or 4 police forces within it. It also he talked about yesterday in the new violent disorder program, greater use of facial recognition technology, which I do welcome, and also police forces using more criminal behaviour orders, such as is used during football hooligans, to prevent them from travelling on trains and tubes, and working with British Transport Police to really share that intelligence. So all of the things he's mentioned are already possible for police forces to do. All of the legislation and processes are already in place. But I think what he's trying to do is to pull that together in a central programme to say, I really want you to get on top of this so that we don't have, mass violent breakout across the summer period. And I think that's what he's concerned about.
To what extent does that concern, and do these announcements even allude to the idea, the perception perhaps, that the policing of events this week was not adequate?
I actually think the police have done a really good job, and people may think, well, you would say that you're a police and crime commissioner, but I genuinely think that it's clearly the situation in Southport has been very, very difficult, and okay, that did turn into a proper what we would call a riot, and we saw police vans set on fire, and homes and other public buildings damaged, particularly the mosque that was a particular target. Now that clearly was very, very tricky, and for Merseyside police, that came upon them very quickly. They were dealing obviously with that large scale murder investigation, and that had obviously come upon them. But then in Hartlepool, yes, 8 people arrested. Manchester protests, 2 people arrested. In my own force in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, just 2 nights ago in Aldershot, we had a similar protest, and we have now got an investigation going on. An arrest will follow. So, and of course, London, 100 people arrested in London. So at each time there's been one of these protests, people have been arrested, action has been taken. So actually, I think the police have stood up quickly, responded to this well, and I think this is more about prevention of what Keir Starmer thinks may be coming over the summer in the reaction to 3 children tragically losing their lives in just the most tragic way. It's just it's horrific.
It is traumatising in so many ways. I just wonder then what you say there, Donna, about the kind of policing response this week, and indeed this idea of trying to prevent further disruption. There is a fascinating reporting in the Times by Tom Witherow looking at the idea, the myth is described, the myth of 2-tier policing. This is the idea that far-right leaders whip up their followers with claims that white working class people are treated worse than black British people or immigrants. And they also sort of point to incidents as what they would describe as evidence of this For example, they say that police officers allowed rioters in Leeds to create havoc for hours 3 weeks ago without intervening. The riots this week were controlled with dogs and shields. But actually, Tom notes in his reporting that police were actually forced to retreat in Leeds. They kind of lost control of the situation, then they could only monitor what was happening from further away and from a helicopter. In terms of the myth busting, the fake news, the misinformation, the two-tier policing in this specific example, what do the police need to do to win back the trust that is being eroded here?
Well, clearly the police work, we are paid for, police officers are paid for by the government and they work to the government's tune, right? And you've just heard the Prime Minister talking about a new violent disorder unit and a violent disorder programme. Now, there are some on the far right and also those that are actually not on the far right. They wouldn't describe themselves as being on the far right, but would refer to themselves as people who in their mind are sticking up for British values, are standing up for our country. I mean, I've spoken to people who've been involved in some of these protests who said to me, look, I don't consider myself to be extreme, but what I do want is for less crime on our streets. I want, certain values. I want integration. I want, communities to be coming together, community cohesion. And people have a right to protest. I think it's so important in this country that we don't try and stifle protest. In terms of the two-tier policing, obviously we've seen a massive growth in the far left protesting over the last 4 or 5 years. Some of it led to climate change and other things. And of course, what happened with George Floyd in America, and then the huge growth in Black Lives Matter across the country as well. The difference being is that one protest can be incredibly disruptive, closing motorways and spraying orange paint over screens in airports, as we saw last week. And then the other type can sometimes become much more direct, as in rioting and can become more violent. And I think that's why the police clearly have an approach that they take when they are trying to crowd control in large-scale protests and or if it gets to a riot. I don't believe that the police themselves approach this as two-tier policing, but it could be argued by some, I suppose, that even creating a violent disorder unit after we've had 3 or 4 incidents, when we've had 2 or 3 years of motorways being closed, spraying paint on public buildings and on paintings, and and also missiles being fired in places like Whitehall by the far left. Is this an overreaction to what's going on from what some would describe as the far right? Possibly. Who knows?
Donna, very helpful to speak to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking part this morning. That's Donna Jones, who is chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners and is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. A couple of your texts. This person doesn't leave their name, but they say you just have to look at police allowing anti-Semitic chanting and incitement to violence by Hamas supporters at their marches versus the police charging into right-wing protesters on Remembrance Weekend. There's evidently bias which drives people to the extremes. It's all left-wing media and establishment bias.